Behold your thinker waiting here. Arise and in the sky appear. Hi everybody, welcome to the channel. My name's Jim. I'd like to continue in this episode with the Great Books Year 1 reading program, and we are up to the play The Clouds by the Greek dramatist Aristophanes. This play follows on the heels of two readings by Plato, the Apology and Crito, which tell of the trial of Socrates. And Socrates features in this play quite prominently too. He's represented very differently from what we've seen before. And this is the translation by David Barrett and Alan Sommerstein in the second edition Great Book set. So let's jump into the fray. We'll do a quick summary of the action and then deep dive into some questions for discussion. And I invite everybody to comment and maybe even make a response video. Anyway, so The Clouds is a satirical comedy about a foolish old-timer by the name of Strepsiades. He's an Athenian farmer burdened by debts, which have mostly been accrued by his lazy son, Phidippides. And the play works through Strepsiades' efforts to avoid paying his creditors. He's trying to find a way out of a jam. Now, first he tries to persuade his son to take lessons at the Thinkery, which is Socrates' school, the school of sophists and natural philosophers, where his son can learn the clever ways of rhetoric so that he can argue his way out of paying the debt. But when this initial effort to convince his son to go to school fails, Strepsiades himself enrolls in the school. And a lot of comic antics ensue from that. So at the Thinkery, Socrates and his followers, who are represented by a chorus of clouds, are caricatured as being very out of touch. These are, head in the clouds intellectuals who are engaged in all kinds of bizarre and impractical pursuits. Strepsiades is a total lost cause. He's incapable of taking instruction. So ultimately, he is kind of booted out of the school, and his son, Phidippides, is sent to get some schooling. And after the son's education is complete, Phidippides comes out and he becomes a skilled debater, but he's using his new rhetorical powers for immoral actions, such as justifying the beating of his own father. The ending is chaotic and caustic. Strepsiades, who's enraged by his son Phidippides' justifications, leads an angry mob to attack and destroy the Thinkery. They set it ablaze, driving out Socrates and his followers. And the play thus ends on this anti-intellectualist note. So with that as a very cursory summary of the play, here are some interpretive big ideas questions that we can pose. And I'll be curious to see what people think about this. First of all, the play is very funny. Like, this particular translation, I think, is probably more accessible than the first edition Great Books of the Western World. And I really want to read the translation in Penguin Classics. I have to see if I have that copy. But in any case, there's different translations out there, and some of them are going to be more accessible than others. So first of all, don't be put off by this play just because it's 2,000 some years old. It actually resonates in a lot of very tangible ways with our way of life today. And the jokes still hit for the most part. In any case, here's question number one. Is Aristophanes' portrayal of Socrates a fair characterization of the man? And is it a fair characterization or representation of philosophical inquiry in general? And why might Aristophanes be anxious about philosophers? And how does this compare to representations of Socrates in the Apology and Crito, which we've read in the first two readings on this reading program? Also, we might compare with Xenophon, who has memories of Socrates that he recounts. Now, in Plato and Xenophon, Socrates is presented as basically a heroic martyr to the cause of truthful inquiry. He's the hero of those stories. And Socrates, who talks about himself as the gadfly on the rear end of the Athenian state, prodding individuals and the state to become their better self, he's a noble guy. He's studying the unexamined life, all very heroic. And he's sacrificing himself, like in the Crito, by refusing to make his escape from jail. He's going to accept the punishment, which is drinking the hemlock, going to his death. So that's very, very different from how he's represented in the Clouds. Here, Socrates is depicted as a ridiculous figure, suspended in a basket above the stage, detached from earthly concerns. He's lumped in with the very natural philosophers and sophists that Socrates himself had said in the Apology that he opposed, that he didn't want to be affiliated with these types of philosophers at all. And he goes to great lengths to argue why he's not a natural philosopher, why he's not a sophist. But here, Aristophanes lumps him in with that crowd. So somebody is not telling the whole truth. To further complicate matters, there's some evidence that Aristophanes and Socrates knew each other and may have been friends. And I know he's in at least one of the Platonic dialogues. I think it's some Symposium, and he may be in another one. So there's, they kind of knew each other. And in fact, there's evidence that Socrates attended the performance of the Clouds. And sort of stood up, and maybe in opposition to how he was being represented on the stage. But in any case, the references, actually Socrates in the Apology references this very play as the source for his tarnished reputation. This kind of got the buzz going like decades before he was ever put on trial. But we just don't know for sure what's really up. Is this character assassination, or is it satire? Is there a grain of truth in how he's being represented dramatically? We can differ on that. Anyway, it's interesting. Now, as for the representation of philosophical inquiry in general, I can't help but feel as if this play, were it rewritten today, or kind of redone for the modern stage, it might cast Socrates as a postmodern philosopher who's deconstructing his merry way through esoteric topics that nobody understands or finds useful. Those kind of intellectuals are out there today. In fact, modern audiences might be just as suspicious and distrustful as the ancient theater goers who might see the thinkery as a threat to traditional education, the old ways of doing things. So the echoes feel very tangible and familiar to me. Now, it's obvious that Aristophanes, like any good satirist, is exaggerating the character of Socrates and the intellectual activities of the thinkery to the point of absurdity, because that gets you laughs. That's what comic poets do. But this isn't just for comic effect. I think there's a strong satirical edge here. He's critiquing the moral risks of pursuing the intellectual life in this rarefied and possibly amoral way. And that's one of the functions of satirical comedy, isn't it? It's a relatively harmless way we have of expressing our anxieties and our reservations about social issues and problems. And in this case, those issues are education and intellectualism. Here's another question. What is the play's perspective on the value of traditional education versus the new learning that's represented by Socrates and the thinkery? Does it seem to advocate for one over the other, or is it more of a nuanced message? I would say that Aristophanes is critical of both, but on the surface, maybe even on balance, the play seems to be favoring the traditional education approach where we ought to teach our students practical knowledge and good, healthy respect for adults and good old family values. But the newfangled thinkers like Socrates and the thinkery, the sophists, are perceived as a threat to all that tradition. Socrates and his ilk are mixing up young minds with these stupid abstractions, the manipulative rhetoric, and the moral relativism. But on the flip side, the play is also satirizing the traditional education, the limitations of that kind of education. So Strepsiades, who's like the poster child for that type of education, he's very foolish. And in his own way, he's out of touch with the times. He's like the proverbial old man shouting at clouds, right? Pun intended here. He's clinging to the past. He's unable to adapt to change. And dramatically speaking, the traditional ways of education are being outfoxed by the newfangled rhetorical prowess that his son acquires at the end of the play. So is Aristophanes suggesting that the old ways of doing things can't stay up to date? That could be the case. Now, what about the thinkery, the new school of learning? Well, Aristophanes appears to be even more critical of them than the traditional ways. Socrates and his gang of educators, his philosophers, are indulging in idle intellectual wankery, which is comically presented, very funny how this is all played out. These guys are sophists. They're clever, but they're very amoral. And we see this directly in the play when witnessing the transformation of Pheidippides from this sort of layabout slacker to a sophistic manipulator. Is Aristophanes splitting the difference here, exposing the weaknesses of both sides? Maybe. Traditional learning seems to be too rigid, not supple enough to grow and adapt. And the new learning is very heady, but it's dangerous because it's giving people tools that can be used for immoral purposes to deceive or to justify wrongdoing. Now, what is the ideal balance? Well, the play is silent on that issue. I'll leave that for you to think on your own terms. All right, let's turn to another question. The theme of persuasion in the play, rhetoric, comes up again, just like it was a big theme in the Apology. How do Strepsiades and Pheidippides use rhetoric? And what does this say about the power of language and argumentation? Is rhetoric presented as a positive or negative force? Strepsiades, his own rhetoric, is clumsy. It's emotionally manipulative. He's not relying on logic. He sees rhetoric as a tool to attain a pragmatic goal, that is, escape my debts. And there's really no ethical concerns to worry about. If we can argue our way out of this, let's do it. His son, Pheidippides, after he goes to the thinkery later in the play, now becomes a master of the sophistical rhetoric, and he can argue any side of any issue. He can engage in elusive wordplay. He can use logical fallacies in a very expert way. He can appeal to logic if he wants, but he can also appeal to pathos to persuade audiences. He can pull the emotional heartstrings. Now, Pheidippides' rhetoric is more sophisticated and intellectual at the end of the play, but it's very morally ambiguous. It's even corrupt, just like the sophists that Socrates loved to criticize in real life. Pheidippides uses rhetorical skills to manipulate and deceive. So winning is everything in this game. Truth and integrity be damned. So rhetoric doesn't really come off so well in the Clouds. Let's turn to another question that has to do with humor and absurdity. How does the play use humor and absurdity to critique social and political norms? Let's dig into some of the ways that the play uses humor. There's also quite a bit of verbal humor and wordplay, as you'd find in typical comedies. Aristophanes is really good at this. He's good with the puns, with the double entendres. And this, people love that. It creates humor. And it's a more subtle way to critique social norms, too. So the language that's used by the characters, particularly by Socrates and Pheidippides, often is satirizing the convoluted and abstract nature of philosophical discourse. It's a lot of funny stuff in here that's poking fun at the over-intellectualized discourse, to use a word that we use a lot these days. That's all being sent up in a very comic way. And the chorus of clouds, who also use very elevated diction and make lots of nonsensical pronouncements, they are also contributing to this verbal humor. Then there's the grotesque and the scatological humor. Now, this is not as prevalent in some of Aristophanes' plays as it may be in other comic plays, but it is there. There are elements of the grotesque and scatological humor in the Clouds. There are fart jokes. There are jokes about private parts and whatnot. Now, these moments, while often shocking or crude, they have a purpose too, because they're disrupting the traditional decorum of things, and that's a further challenge of the social conventions. And again, I think this is partly what comedy is good at. It's sort of allowed to do that kind of thing. We permit it to have the dirty jokes, the kind of offensive humor and everything, because it does serve a bit of a social function, I think. It also grounds the play in the realities of human experience. People like the fart jokes and so on. They connect with it. And that's a stark contrast between the very abstract world of the thinkery, the intellectuals. You have this very down-to-earth sort of grotesque humor, obscenities, and then you have the highfalutin, up in the clouds, abstract thinkers who are just kind of intellectually wanking off. Now, there's plenty of room in Aristophanes for the cheap laugh, as well as the more nuanced kind of satirical humor. As usual with these deep dives, I like to think about relevance. So to what extent is the Clouds still relevant to contemporary audiences in our day and age? What are some of the universal themes or issues that it addresses that continue to resonate? And are there modern-day Socratics or Strepsiades types that we can recognize? I think the answer to that last question is certainly yes. I've already touched on it. But the play's broad concerns about education, social change, generation conflict, and the power of rhetoric, these continue to resonate, in my opinion. The tension between traditional values and new ideas, the anxieties surrounding intellectual pursuits and their potential impact on morality, and the dangers of persuasive language that is divorced from ethical considerations. These are all issues that I think people, maybe in different forms, are still talking about. They manifest somewhat differently, but they still are banging around like a pinball in the pinball machine. We can recognize modern day Strepsiades types in individuals who are maybe struggling with debt, for example. That's something that a lot of people could identify with, I think. They might sympathize with Strepsiades here. People who are clinging to outdated traditions, like old fogies, people who don't want to keep up with the times, with the new trends, people who are feeling overwhelmed by rapid shifts in society, and they feel like they're being left behind. There's a lot of resonance there. And similarly, we can find echoes of the Socratic, sophistical types of thinkers in our modern day intellectuals and academics whose ideas are actually challenging conventional wisdom or are perceived to be challenging conventional wisdom, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. And the specific contexts might be different today, but like there are parallels. I think there are echoes here. And let's face it, at least speaking in terms of American culture, there is a heavy strain of anti-intellectualism in our society. People just, they don't like experts. They don't want to listen to experts. They don't want to be made to feel like they're dumb. They are defiant with their ignorance. And then on the other hand, the people who are sort of in academia, let's say, there's a lot of people who their heads really are in the clouds. They really are kind of out of touch. They are just like reflecting off of one another, and they seem to be so divorced from reality that people don't even understand what they're saying, and they're making no attempt to translate what they're thinking into comprehensible ideas that could maybe have a more real impact on people's lives. So yeah, there is a lot of very resonant aspects to the clouds. I just reread this to prep for the video. I found it very fresh, like very funny. I'm not kidding you. There was like some moments that were laugh out loud funny, just as I was reading it. A lot of fun. Now, next up, we're going to move to another comic play by Aristophanes called Lysistrata. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you like and subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next video. Happy reading.